Thanks very much for joining us in this webinar this afternoon it is now, and for your patience in waiting. What we would really like to do, my name is Carrick and I'm a project manager with the Improvement Service. What we would really like to do this afternoon, is outline some of the findings from the recent data analysis from the Money Advice Performance Management Framework, and my colleague Paige will lead on that. We'd also like to share with you some of the findings from some work that we've been doing on the future of money advice services. We've started a consultation process and we're hoping that you will participate in that in the course of this webinar and possibly after the event too. It seems really appropriate that in Financial Capability Week we are actually looking at the future of money advice services and how we can sustain it for coming years. But at the start of this, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paige, who will talk about some of the findings.
Hi, so I'm Paige. I work as a project officer on the Money Advice Outcomes project at the Improvement Service. And before I run through the key findings for 2016-17, just going to give a quick little bit of background information and some updates to do with the Money Advice Performance Management Framework. So, as a lot of you will probably know, this is a performance management framework for money advice services funded by local authorities in Scotland. This is the third iteration of the framework, so we can really start to look at trends across the years of recording now. And it's also worth noting that we've seen some really significant improvements in the reporting across most of the indicators year on year. So both in terms of the increasing number of local authorities reporting on indicators and the decreasing use of the not recorded and don't know recording categories. This webinar will be used to highlight the key findings of the data analysis for the 16/17 financial year. Where possible, we'll also make comparisons with previous year's data, but we will be publishing the full annual report for the 16/17 financial year in mid-December, where the key findings will be discussed in more detail and any caveats will also be fully outlined. We'll also be hosting our annual workshops for the framework on the 27th of November and the 6th of December in Edinburgh and Glasgow, to which we've sent out invitations to all our local authority contacts. We'll be at these workshops, we'll be discussing and seeking feedback on future developments, as well as providing updates on associated work. So I'll just take you into the key findings now. First, going to talk about the number of money advice services that were funded by local authorities in 2016-17, the level of investment and the staff numbers. So as you can see, a total of 20 internal and 76 externally provided money advice services were funded by local authorities to some extent in 2016 and 17. It's worth knowing all 32 Scottish local authorities provided funding for at least one service, whether that is internal or external. In comparison to 2015-16, the number of internal services funded by local authorities has fallen by 3, so from 23 services to 20. In contrast, the number of external services has increased by 4, from 72 to 76. So this kind of remains in line with the findings from 2014-15 and 2015-16. The difference between those years were that internal services decreased by 1 and the number of external services remained steady. So in terms of investment in internal services in 2016-17, this sat around 4.1 million, which is a decrease of around 540,000 in comparison to 2015-16. In terms of external services, there was a 7.62 million investment in 2016-17, and this represents a £40,000 increase in comparison to 2015-16. So the total investment sits at around 11.72 million for 2016-17, and that's a decrease of around £500,000 in comparison to 2015-16 investment levels. It should be noted as well that the increase in funding for external services between 2015-16 and 2016-17 has been significantly impacted by one local authority matching European Social Fund investment coming into the area. So if we remove this funding from the analysis, we do get a sort of decreasing trend for external funding. So that is worth bearing in mind, and just to reiterate, we will discuss this in full detail in the report. Moving on to staff and volunteer numbers, there were 94 full-time equivalent paid staff employed by internal money advice services across Scotland in 2016-17. Compared to 2015-16, this represents a decrease of 6 full-time equivalent staff members. The number of paid staff employed by external money advice services rose by 1 full-time equivalent between 2015-16 and 2016-17 to a total of 211. In terms of volunteers in external services, there were 130 full-time equivalent volunteers, and this was an increase of around 25 full-time equivalent in comparison to 2015-16. However, it should probably be noted that this figure has fluctuated over the years quite dramatically, so there's no clear trend in terms of external volunteers. So next, going to talk through the findings in terms of the demographics of clients using the service across Scotland in 2016-17. So across the 31 local authorities who reported on the measure, 54% of those accessing the services were female, while 46% were male. So this finding remains consistent with that reported in 2015-16, when around 29 local authorities reported. Moving on, slightly over half, so 53% of those accessing money advice services reported having a disability or long-term condition. So this does represent a proportionate increase when compared to previous years. So in 2014-15, 46% of clients reported having a disability or long-term condition, and this increased very slightly to 47% in 15-16. So this is a sort of notable increase. And also the number of local authorities reporting on this measure has improved throughout the years. So we're very likely starting to get a more accurate picture on a Scotland-wide level. In terms of income, 90% of clients accessing money advice services in 2016-17 had a household income of less than £20,000. So if we drill down further into this, we can also see that 50% of clients had a household income of less than £10,000 and 31% had a household income of less than £6,000. Again, this is consistent with previous year's findings, and again, the number of local authorities reporting on this measure has steadily risen. It's also worth noting that 41% of clients accessing money advice services in 2016-17 were unemployed or permanently retired from work, compared to 14% who were unemployed and seeking work. And this is according to the 31 local authorities who reported on this measure. So this statistic very much highlights the sort of pertinent issue of in-work poverty. And again, this remains largely consistent with previous year's findings. And again, reporting has also consistently improved on this indicator throughout the years. Moving on to the amount of debt owed, there was around £217 million in total debt owed in 2016-17, according to the 29 local authorities who submitted data. This is around £2 million increase on that reported in 2015-16, when just one less local authority reported on this measure. So the most common types of debt owed are credit store and charge cards, that represents about 19% of debt owed, mortgage arrears, which represents around 14%, unsecured personal loans, represents around 13%, and council tax arrears, which represents around 10%. So now we're going to move on to volume. So these are findings related to the activity of money advice services in 2016-17, in particular the number of clients who access the service and the channels used to make contact. So in 2016-17, 49,565 new clients accessed money advice across the 28 local authorities that submitted data on this measure. So that's an average of around 1,770 per local authority area. And compared to the previous year, this represents an increase of around 3%, when the same number of local authorities reported on the measure. In terms of total clients, this The measure of total clients includes both new clients and clients whose support has continued from the previous financial year. So it gives us perhaps a better indication of the overall kind of workload of money advice services. So the total number of clients accessing money advice services in 2016-17 was 59,641, according to the 29 local authorities who submitted data on this indicator or had a minimum figure calculated on their behalf. A few local authorities didn't submit a total clients figure, so it was assumed that the minimum amount of total clients that they had was their new client figure due to the definition of the indicator. So it's very likely that the total number of clients accessing money advice will be underestimated. And while this data wasn't requested in 2015-16, and therefore we can't really identify a clear trend there, it is likely that total clients will have increased in line with the increase in new clients accessing the services. In terms of channel of access to money advice services then, 70% of clients contacted the services face-to-face, followed by 19% who made contact via the telephone, 9% by email and 2% via the web. Only 20 local authorities submitted data on this measure, however, so the figures may not accurately reflect the true picture of service delivery across Scotland. As with other indicators in the performance management framework, this is very likely to improve year on year. So we'll move on to debt strategy. In terms of debt strategies, 11,268 were agreed in 2016-17, according to the 30 local authorities who reported. And this represents an increase of around 40% in comparison to 2015-16, when 28 local authorities reported on this measure. And the most common debt strategies in 2016-17 were pro rata offers, which represented around 27% of strategies, token repayments represented around 17%, sequestration, which represented around 16%, repayment plans, which represented about 10%. And it's also worth sharing with you at this point that we are working with the accountant in bankruptcy to cross-reference information on statutory debt strategies. And lastly, we have the financial gain figures and overall return on investment. So in terms of financial gain, it is £100.7 million in total, and that includes both verified and unverified gain, and is based on 25 local authorities submitting figures. This equates to an average of £4 million per local authority area, though of course this differs markedly between each. If we take that with the level of investment, we find that every £1 invested in money advice service provision in 2016-17 generated from £4 to £9 in financial gain for clients. The range here comes from the fact that if you use verified gain only, you get the return of £4, and if you include unverified gain, you get a return of £9 on every £1 invested. So this finding builds very slightly on those reported in 2014-15 and 2015-16, where it was found that every £1 invested saw client gains of £4 to £6. However, it should be noted that this is likely due to the inclusion of unverified gain in the reporting in 2016-17, when this wasn't included in 2015-16. And therefore, we have had a few more local authorities reporting unverified gain to us in comparison to previous years. So that probably does play into the increase in the top range of that. It should also be highlighted that the financial gain reported here relates solely to that secured through money advice services that are delivered directly or funded by local authorities. So the benefits provided by services that are supported through other funding streams aren't taken into account. And therefore the total benefits resulting from the work of all money advice services in Scotland are likely to be significantly greater than those found via this performance management framework. And so that's all the key findings that I have for you at the moment. As mentioned earlier, we will be publishing the full report in mid-December alongside individual reports for all 32 Scottish local authority areas, where these findings will be discussed in greater detail, and all caveats will be highlighted in detail also, and they are obviously very important. We'll also have our stakeholder workshops, as I've mentioned, at the end of this month and early December to discuss the framework in more detail with local authorities and their partners. If you have any questions about the key findings, feel free to ask them and I'll try my best to answer. As we're just highlighting the key findings at the moment, I may not be able to answer them all without taking a closer look at the data first, but I'll let you know when that's the case and we can take a look into that when we're finalising the report. I'm going to pass you over to Karen now, who's going to talk through the future developments for the framework.
Thanks very much for that whistle-stop tour, Paige. As Paige has mentioned there, this is an iterative process. So each year we review what's worked, what needs to be changed and what we want to retain. The future developments for the coming iteration of the framework are really based on some research that we've undertaken and some partnership work. We worked with Toynbee Hall to explore the use of the MAP tool to see if we could identify some softer client outcomes. And we also participated in the Harmonising Indicators project, which was facilitated by Evaluation Support Scotland and funded by Citizens Advice Scotland. That group really looked at developing common demographic measures and also sought to start to identify some of the softer client outcomes that arise from advice. So really what we're suggesting is based on some work that we've undertaken with them and also some discussions with the Scottish Government. What we are proposing is that we have a common advice reporting framework so that we seek to capture in a consistent way the data and the benefits and measures that are related to advice. In the initial stages, we would look at restricting this to welfare advice. So that being the case, what we would need to do is to consider some indicators that would be appropriate to measure welfare advice. We have quite a good basis in the Money Advice Performance Management Framework in relation to the wider indicators for demographics, for financial gain, for things like that. We also have specific indicators that are relevant for money advice, and what we would need to do is replicate that for welfare advice. The kind of indicators that we're thinking about, and I do want to stress this from the outset, that this isn't our framework, it's a local authority framework. So any changes we make will be based on discussion and agreement. But the indicators that we're talking about potentially are the number and type of benefit claims, any appeals and the resultant outcomes. And we also feel that we would need to tighten up the definition of financial gain because it can be interpreted in different ways by different agencies and authorities. That would be the starting point for the discussion on this going forward. As I've said, there will be discussion on this at the workshops that Paige has referred to. We're also looking at incorporating some additional client outcomes. At the moment, probably the primary client outcome relates to financial gain. And as Paige has already explained, there are issues with that. But we all recognise the multiple benefits of advice, and so we would like to incorporate on a consistent basis some of what are considered to be softer client outcomes. So we are looking at possibly introducing measures for health and well-being and also for the increased capacity that people get as a result of accessing good quality advice. So as I've said, these will be the topics that will be discussed at the workshops that are coming up later this month and in December. I think, though, we've got to set the context of money and indeed advice services in relation to what's happening with local government funding. I've put this slide up and it depicts the graph of doom, as we call it, in the improvement service. It's a projection based on some data that we have, which illustrates how demand is increasing, but at the same time, government finance and resources are declining. In that context, the context of reducing public sector funding, we've got to work more efficiently and effectively. We've also got to recognise that advice services all too often suffer in relation to other services like education, like health and social care, which are often considered to be protected priorities. In several local authorities, there's been an across-the-board cut, and that can impact disproportionately on money and other advice services. We also know that there is increasing demand with welfare reform and the rollout of universal credit. So that is the context that we're looking at sustaining and indeed developing money advice services. We're not here looking at some blue sky thinking. What we're looking at is, this is the situation. What can we do to meet demand in what are particularly adverse circumstances? The Improvement Service has done a fair bit of research in relation to this. We've produced 2 papers in the past couple of years, The Future of Money Advice Services in Scotland, and a summary of the impact of the 2016 local authority budget cuts on money advice services. In relation to the latter, probably the budget cuts have not been as severe as we predicted. But as Paige has explained, there is still a downward trend, and we've been fortunate to, in some local authorities, that they've been able to secure European social funding. And as we all know what's happening with Brexit, that's not likely to be something that will happen in the future. The research recommendations that we've put forward are that collaboration is required to support service transformation and to plan what is required at national and local levels. I think we can all agree to that. And that there are already in place some alternative approaches to how money advice and advice services are structured and the ways in which they're delivered to the public and service users. And I think the learning from that we need to share more effectively. But we also need to acknowledge that to maintain investment, we need to demonstrate the social and economic value of the service, and that we need to achieve best value in the current financial climate. And that will definitely require avoiding service duplication, sharing resources, and service innovation. And all these areas are not without their challenges. Having made these research recommendations, we've not really been putting them into practice on a consistent basis and sharing the evidence from the approaches that have been taken. So what we have decided to do for the coming year is to produce a strategic paper that provides information on the position and development of money advice services. But having strategies is all very well, but they're pretty meaningless unless they're actually turned into action. So what we also want to do is work in partnership to develop suggested service delivery plans for 2018-21. Now, we recognise that each local authority will operate slightly differently, but what we are trying to do is just, if you like, develop some good practice that can be shared and which can be adapted to best meet local needs. The way that we're going to do that, and we've started this process, this is stage 2, is that we had a focus group of key stakeholders last month. There was a wide range of interested bodies, and they came up with some suggestions and some comments on the way forward, which I'll subsequently share with you. What we also need to do, though, is consult with everybody who has a potential interest in securing the future of money advice services. So once we have drafted the strategic paper, we want to share that with people. Indeed, we want to do that before we actually write the paper. We want to make sure that the content of that reflects what's actually happening on the ground and which actually meets people's aspirations. So the idea is that after we've given some feedback, some information on the suggested comment, you will have the opportunity to feedback to us. And following that, we'll produce a draft strategy, which again, we will seek your views on before transforming that into a service delivery plan. As I've said, we had an initial focus group of key stakeholders. Now, what I've got to say here is that what I am reflecting to you is the view of all the stakeholders. It will come as no surprise to find out that there wasn't agreement, and the stakeholders came from a wide range of backgrounds with very different perspectives. What we started off by doing was asking people, well, what do you see as the challenges? But it soon became apparent that one person's challenge is another person's opportunity. So I'll present to you the findings that they came up, the suggestions they came up with in relation to the challenges. And and then we can look at what is actually happening currently to address these challenges. So one of the main barriers or challenges that people saw was in relation to culture. There are a wide range of organisations involved in providing money advice services. They have very different ethoses and very different approaches. For some of the more traditional organisations, change can be seen as very challenging, and that's a factor that we have to take into account. There was also a recognition that it is quite a politicised sector, that there is a need to make sure that we raise awareness with elected members and we seek to improve their understanding of services. And many authorities and elected members have their own culture as well that they take forward when they decide what services to invest in. There were some concerns that we needed to make sure that we avoided looking at what the sector needs and ignoring what the customer needs, because they're not always the same thing. The way that it was felt we could possibly do that, and this is the opportunity, is if that we had a shared strategic vision that encompasses all sectors. We also looked at service delivery, and I think underpinning that is that there are disparities across the country. As you'll see from the individual local authority reports that Paige is producing, there's a very different picture from one area to the next. So what we need to do is balance the need for the national need for this service, and it is needed on a national consistent basis, with what's happening in local situations, and there needs to be a balancing act to achieve this. We also need to start to have a conversation with providers around channel shift. I know there are some concerns about this, but channel shift is inevitable given what's happening in other policy areas. There was also the suggestion that we should start to be open with clients about channel shift, and regardless of the preferred service delivery model of the service provider, we needed to have an honest conversation with customers or clients about what channels were available to them, because it could be that another organisation was better placed to provide services in the way that best met that individual needs. There's a recognition that staff are working in extremely difficult circumstances at the moment, and it's recognised too that staff need to be trained and supported, and to be able to access good quality case management recording systems and referral pathways. There was a suggestion too that, again, to make this easier for a national service, this should happen or should be considered in terms of a national basis. We're not saying that everybody should be using the same system, but the basic principles on which those systems are founded, there should be a degree of commonality. Whilst there was a recognition that staff needed support, there was also suggestion that staff needed to be a bit more flexible in the approaches that they took. There was quite a lot of discussion about the positioning of money advice services. It's a really cluttered landscape. Lots of people are doing advice to varying degrees and in varying different capacities. There's advice services in the NHS and housing and external providers too. Because of that, the complexity of the policy environment, we need to ensure that money advice has a clear status. The kind of status or the nature of that status was subject to a bit of discussion. Some people felt that the only way this could be achieved was from having a standalone service, whereas for others it was felt that it could be integrated and more closely joined to existing services that were being provided. Partnership approaches were seen as essential to take this forward. There were many opportunities people acknowledged and many successful examples of partnership working, but there was still in some instances a reluctance sometimes to work together. And I think trying to unpick why that was the case, we identified that a lot of this related to fear of loss of funding. There were also some concerns that the local authorities were kind of in a difficult position here because they had to manage a relationship between council as both funder and provider. Again, the opportunity for this, we felt, was the need to develop this shared strategic vision, where people really understood the different ways that partnership models could operate, and the key factors that would result in successful partnerships. There was also a suggestion that there needed to be more equality between partners. It will come as no surprise that one of the other issues that we identified was funding. And I think everybody would like more funding, but we've got to be realistic about this, and that's not going to happen. But what possibly could happen, and it was suggested we should be lobbying for, was longer term funding. Short-term funding is particularly problematic in terms of establishing services and retaining staff. So there was a clear suggestion that we should be moving towards longer-term 3 to 5 year funding, and that funders should be persuaded to adopt this approach. In terms of securing funding, it was suggested that there was a difficulty in understanding the work and how it benefits citizens, and that we needed to be a bit better at demonstrating the impact and the contribution of all the providers in this sector, not just local authorities, but just across the piece. But to do that, funders and service providers need to have a clearer and better understanding of what the services actually are delivering. We then went on to look at what actions are currently being undertaken. And I'm going to give you some examples of actions that are being undertaken to transform services and to address some of the challenges. There are lots that were suggested that it would take me a day almost to quote to you. We've got lots of examples, but we would really like more so that we can highlight those that are most effective. Key to sustaining service is improving the evidence base. And a lot of work has been done on this field by the Money Advice Service, who have the What Works Fund, have undertaken research over indebtedness as well, along with other information. There was a webinar earlier this week, which again gave support to the evidence base. The Scottish Government are currently undertaking a review of advice services, and that will draw on knowledge gathered through research and stakeholder engagement. It was also suggested that further education sector establishments could contribute towards improving the evidence base by carrying out independent reviews of the outcomes of advice projects. But there was a real recognition that we needed to get better and improve and collate and present better the evidence that is available. Other actions that are being taken to transform services are investment in outcomes. There were many examples of local authorities and others providing practical support by improving case management recording systems, being able to speed up services to clients by providing information online and by emails. There's also been the integration of services and coordination of council department functions within local authorities, and that's in many cases been undertaken on the basis that this will deliver better outcomes for service users. Some local authorities have moved towards embedding delivery of client outcomes in service level agreements so that they can establish from the outset that the services that they are providing or supporting will actually deliver improved outcomes for clients. This has been done as well on an in-house basis by looking at different service delivery models. For example, Falkirk Council are using advice hubs. There was a recognition too that to transform services and to improve outcomes, there needed to be earlier intervention and better targeting of services. There was a focus too on developing preventative work, and we all know that financial education is really important in this, and starting at the youngest possible age. And the Money Advice Service are planning to undertake some research on what exists in Scotland and in the UK in relation to financial education. The Scottish Government are looking at developing a Scottish financial health check for families with children and a pilot for older people, again getting in the early stages. And in Dundee City Council, the local authority and the voluntary sector, Brooksbank and the local CABs, are embedding advice workers in health centres with access to medical records to ensure that people are picked up at an early stage when their issues are actually starting to affect their health, and so that medical practices can refer them on to the advice support that they need. They're also looking at extending this to schools by working with teachers and family support. In relation to channel choice, Edinburgh City Council are considering moving away from face-to-face advice where appropriate. And I do need to put a caveat in here. Channel choice needs to be very much related to customer needs and preferences. There will still be a need for face-to-face service delivery, but perhaps not in every case. They're also looking at how they can improve access in Edinburgh to online services. And there are many examples of collaborative working. This is taking place across all sectors, involving a whole range of partners, but with varying degrees of success. And we need to find out more about what approaches work and why. We need to be able to identify what are the barriers and what are the enablers in this. So in relation to our strategy to safeguard future services, these are the principles that we think need to underpin it. Now, they are principles, they need to be expanded upon, and there may be others that you think should be included. Service transformation is critical. It is going to be a case of doing more with less, but better. And that's a major challenge. To achieve that, there is going to have to be a better balance between what might be the sector needs and what our customer needs. Funding remains an issue, but for the reasons that I've already outlined, the solution to this is not going to be securing more funding. There's also a need to raise awareness. As I've outlined, there is a body of existing research and it's ongoing. But what we need to do is make sure that the messages are being conveyed to the people who are making the decisions in a way which they can relate to and which will ultimately influence the decisions that they take in relation to supporting advice services. It's essential that we adopt a strategic approach. All too often, a piecemeal approach is taken towards this, and different organisations operate in different ways. That's still essential and important, so we've got that real choice for people. But there are certain principles that we can and we do all unite around, and they need to be pulled together in a strategic approach that we can all sign up to. We also need to demonstrate very clearly the multiple benefits that advice services deliver across a whole range of services and sectors, and which result in many, many outcomes for service users. So in conclusion, what are really the key points that I really want to make are that the service has multiple benefits, is of national importance and is delivered at a local level. And we've got to get that kind of consistency. We have to try to ensure that we have a national service which takes account of local needs and aspirations, but which we all work to support. But equally importantly, we've had lots of strategies, but unless we put them into practice, there will be no change. So without strategy, execution is useless. Without execution, strategy is useless. So it's getting a fine balancing act here. This is, as I've said, the second stage in the consultation process. I'm hoping that you may wish to comment on what's been suggested. And again, I would reiterate that I've tried to pull together the variety of views that were expressed and group them into common themes. You may wish to comment on the expressions that have been made to date, or you may wish to put forward other suggestions. We are seeking your views in this webinar, but also we'll be writing out to people after the event to continue the conversation that we hope will result in positive change. Thank you for listening. Our contact details are on the screen now, so please feel free to email you, and there is a limited time for any questions that people have.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to say sorry once again for the computer and sound issues. I hope it all came through clear in the end. If you have any questions for Paige or for Sandra, or any comments on what you've heard today, please use the questions pane on your panel on the right side of your screen, I believe. Do you have any sort of roundup follow-up that is there something that you want people especially to do other than comment on the section here? But
what we will be doing is we're sending out a survey afterwards. But as I've said, our contact details are here. We've given an overview of the findings from the data returns, but also I'm hoping that we've started the conversation and we're looking for comments about the future of money advice services. So people should feel free to comment however they feel most appropriate. They can drop us an email or they can give us a call, but we're looking to engage as many people as possible in this process going forward.
Okay. We don't seem to have any comments or questions coming in, so unless somebody is typing now, I think we're going to round up and say thank you very much for staying during the webinar, and thank you very much, Carrick and Paige, for doing this presentation. The session was recorded, so if you have missed some of it, you will be able to find it on the Knowledge Hub in the Money Advice Knowledge Hub group. Thank you very much for listening, and have a nice day.